Since I could remember, I had always experienced sleep paralysis. On a weekly basis, I would awake to the dread of the inevitable. I was conscious, but my body was paralyzed and there was nothing I could do. I never understood it when I was young, and was too anxious to bring it up to my parents at the time. I would worry that there was something wrong with me, and hoped that I could get through the night in peaceful sleep. As I got older, I began searching the internet and found many online forums on the subject. There was so much relief in knowing I wasn't alone, and that it was quite common. But through reading other stories, I discovered a darker side to the experience. So many people would claim of feeling a presence in their room, a feeling of something pressing on their chest, preventing them from breathing, or dark figures lurking in the shadows. I was thankful. I had never experienced anything other than the paralysis itself, so I was more relieved. It could have been much worse. Living with my parents in my childhood home, I sometimes found myself on edge if I were left alone for the night, but I was never too uncomfortable living there. In the end, sleep paralysis had become normal for me. When I turned 21, I left home and rented a house together with my boyfriend. It was a mid-terraced house and not very old, probably built in the 70s or so. We moved in late into the year, around October, and tried to settle into a new routine together. From the start, though, I felt uneasy. But it was my first time living away from home on a permanent basis, so we both put it down to that. Though as the months progressed, things didn't change. The house felt heavy, as though a weight was pulling me down emotionally. There were frequent arguments, and I was becoming increasingly anxious. A year had passed, and nothing changed. My boyfriend worked the night shift, and I found myself worrying at the thought of being left alone in the house. I've always been introverted, and unless we went out to walk the dog together, I was too nervous to go outside in a strange neighborhood alone. In my spare time, I would never sit downstairs to watch TV, but would hide away in the spare bedroom on my computer while my boyfriend slept. The only time I ventured downstairs was to the kitchen when I needed to eat or drink, or when I had to leave for work. At night, I would wave goodbye to my boyfriend, and then hurry into the bedroom, shutting the door and staying there until he came home the next morning. Some nights, our dog would wake up and scratch at the bedroom door to be let out. Nothing filled me with more dread than having to go downstairs in the middle of the night. She would go into the garden while I stood in the doorway waiting for her, and praying she wouldn't take long. I would feel the heaviness and darkness around me, and felt this intense sense of urgency to get back upstairs and into the bedroom where it was safe. I couldn't even sleep in the dark alone anymore, and began leaving the TV on all night for comfort. I soon came to realize that this wasn't homesickness. Something wasn't right about this house. Finally, after 18 months or so, my boyfriend was getting his promotion and we were ready to buy our own house. I was relieved at the thought of leaving, but knew it would take time to find somewhere that we could afford. He began attending day courses as part of his promotion, and it was during that time I had my final and most terrifying sleep paralysis. As usual, I'd had a terrible night's sleep, and although I was alone for the day, the sun was shining and I was feeling upbeat. We'd finally found the perfect house and were hoping to move in within the next few months. I pushed open the bedroom curtains wide and let the sun shine in. It wasn't very often those curtains were opened. They were usually kept closed for my boyfriend to sleep during the day, so the room very rarely saw the sun. Seeing it now filled with warmth and light was somewhat comforting. I didn't have work until later in the day, so I decided to take a nap. I lay on the bed, looking out through the window across from me, the breeze flowing through the trees and the birds perched upon the branches. Slowly but surely, I drifted off to sleep. I don't know how much time had passed. I was sure my boyfriend hadn't come home yet, and I could still feel the warmth of the sun shining through the window. But before I'd opened my eyes, I knew immediately what was happening. I was paralyzed. Thankfully, I was still laying on my back. Sometimes paralysis came when my face was pressed into my pillow, and I would feel as though I would suffocate if I didn't move soon. So this I could handle. As I slowly opened my eyes, instant fear came over me. In all those years and all those stories I'd read, it was actually happening. Stood in front of the window, a few feet from the bed, was the shadow I'd read so much about. It was a human form and completely black. Its head was tilted, ever so slightly, as though gazing down at me, though it had no eyes. All I could do was stare up at the menacing presence that was before me. The fear was overwhelming. The hatred and evil this thing projected was intense to the point of tears. It was as if all the anxiety, dread and unease this house brought upon me suddenly came together in human form, as if whatever was in the house had finally decided to make itself known and confirm to me that it was here and it had been watching me all along. If you've ever experienced sleep paralysis, you'll know it's impossible to talk. You can move your mouth and attempt to scream at the top of your lungs, but nothing will come out. But this thing had to leave. After all these years of waiting, it wanted me to see it, and I did, and I wanted it to feel my hate for it in return. With all the strength I could gather, I clenched my fists and attempted to scream at it. I knew nothing would happen, but I needed to say it. With a muffled and weak voice, I cried, "Get out of my house." Its head turned ever so slightly to look past me. Within a split second, it had vanished. I was left staring at an empty space through the window where it once stood. It wasn't quite over yet, though. I was still paralyzed and I needed to get up. With only a small amount of movement in my one arm, I slowly reached for my bedside table, hoping I could pull myself free. But suddenly, the fear returned, and I realized that it was still here. Only this time, I felt it to my right. But with my head firmly paralyzed to the left and facing the window, I couldn't turn to see it or what it was doing. I felt it, though. A cold, menacing, icy touch along my right arm, working its way slowly up from my wrist and along the forearm. With tears forming, I tried to scream at it again, but it suddenly stopped, and I felt its presence fade, as if it wanted that one last moment to remind me that it was never really going to leave. With movement returning, I gripped the corner of my bedside table and pulled myself up and out of paralysis. Breathing heavily and still on edge, I glanced around the room to check it was gone and immediately looked at my arm. It felt cold, as though its touch lingered. That small portion of my right arm from wrist to elbow was freezing cold and filled with goosebumps, and all the hairs in that area of my arm were stood completely on end. I rubbed it gently to warm it up, looked over to our dog for comfort, and then nervously turned on the TV to pass the time until my boyfriend came home. I didn't see the shadow again, and a few months later, we moved out and into our new home. Within the first year of living in our new house, the paralysis became less and less frequent. Arguments were scarce, and our relationship improved. Over the last several years, sleep paralysis has completely ceased. This house is peaceful and comforting, and even when I'm alone, I feel completely safe and at ease. I never understood why the shadow waited so long to show itself, why I never saw it during my childhood years, if the house we rented fueled its behavior somehow, or why the paralysis has completely stopped since we left. Though I seem to finally be free of the experience, I still recall the horror of the shadow and wonder if it's still around, waiting to show itself again when I least expect it.